Okay, welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to go through the long-run demand for labor. So far, we've explored how firms determine the optimal combination of labor and capital so that they can minimize costs while producing a certain level of output. This involved understanding the isoquants and the isocost lines and how firms use these two curves to make cost-effective decisions. In the short run, firms might face constraints that, limit their ability to change their input mix. So they can't choose between different levels of labor and capital. So for example, the pizza shop might be unable to acquire additional ovens or hire more workers beyond a certain point. However, in the long run, firms have more flexibility. We define the long run, remember, as having complete flexibility in order to choose all inputs into labor or into production. Excuse me. So firms can adjust both labor and capital, so their decisions on how much of each to use are much more dynamic. Long-run demand for labor examines how firms decide on the amount of labor they need when they have the flexibility to adjust both labor and capital. In the long run, firms are not only able to choose how many workers to hire, but how much capital to invest in. So they can make more strategic decisions about their input mix in order to maximize their profits, unlike what we saw in the short run. So in the long run, firms use their production function to determine the most efficient mix of labor and capital. So now they're concerned about both instead of just one before. This production function helps firms understand how changes in both the quantity of labor and in capital affect their total output, which helps guide them in making optimal decisions. So in the upcoming section, we'll be talking about in this lecture, we're going to explore how the long-run demand for labor is influenced by changes in wages, in capital costs, and in other factors. We'll then look at how firms adjust their labor and capital inputs over time to achieve their profit maximizing goals. So we're tempted to just simply shift the isocost line around the point COLR or C0LR, because if the firm chooses to produce without any workers, just relying on capital, the cost will be the same. However, in reality, this isn't the case. So this graph that we see here is not correct. It's not exactly what we're going to do. In reality, we have the scale effect and the substitution effect taking place, which will require us to do a little bit more work. The substitution effect basically is just that when we change the cost of one of the inputs, that's going to change how much of the other we're going to want to use. So for instance, if the wages for workers fall, it now becomes relatively cheaper to hire more workers, so they're going to shift away from using capital to more workers. However, we also have the scale effect, meaning how much a firm wants to produce. Because if costs change, if they either increase or decrease, that will affect how much a firm wants to produce for their total output. So if we would rotate around the point, like we see here, that is incorrect. That would say the firm's outlays are being held constant. Firms do not have to incur the same cost before. They don't have to, incur the same costs that they have before a wage change, after that wage change. And when wage rates change over time, they can choose either higher or lower costs depending on the situation and which way that wages change. So that's why simply rotating the ISO cost line will not work for this. We need a more precise way to analyze how a decrease in wages affects a firm's decision about labor and capital. So the entire ISO cost line ends up shifting, not just rotating. And this shift reflects the new budget constraint and how the firms adjust its input choices to maintain cost efficiency. In this graph, on the left, on the first side, we see how a decrease in wages lowers a firm's marginal cost. So this is going to potentially influence its production decisions. As we move from the marginal cost curve MC0 to MC1, this means that the profit maximizing decision is to increase production because the marginal cost is decreasing. So in this case, that's going to be moving from 100 units to 150 units. Because this firm faces a lower marginal cost, they can produce more and to maintain their maximum profit. Now, the second graph here shows the more accurate approach for what happens when wages or labor changes. So as in this example, wages fall, the ISO cost line shifts outward, reflecting the firm's increased ability to afford more labor or capital. This shift in the ISO cost line allows us to see how a firm's optimal input mix changes in response to the lower cost of labor, This is specifically because now wages are lower. We then find a new point where the shifted isocost line is tangent to the isoquant, indicating the firm's new optimal combination of inputs. This process shows us how firm adjusts its labor and capital usage to achieve cost minimization under the new wage conditions. Now, what is important to note is that the isocost line shifts out and it rotates at the same time. So because the wage rate changed, we're going to see a rotation in that line, and then it shifts out because in this case, it's the wages fell, so it's less costly for the firm. So we have two simultaneous effects going on here. Isocost line shifts outwards because of lower wages. The firm can afford to hire more labor with the same budget. So for a given amount of capital, the firm can now employ more workers. So let's put this in a more concrete perspective. Imagine that you have a fixed budget for your firm. If the cost of one item, in this case, labor, drops, you can now buy more of that item, or you could use your budget totally differently. The isocost line shifts outwards because the firm's budget stretches further to cover more labor or more capital. The line also rotates. This is because the slope of the isocost line reflects the ratio of the price of labor to the price of capital. When wages fall, that ratio decreases, which means the cost of labor relative to capital has changed. In this case, it decreases. This alters the slope of the line, which causes it to rotate. So we see both an outward shift and the rotation. So imagine a factory where wages fall. Before the wage falls, the factory can afford 10 workers and 5 machines. After the wage drops, the factory can now afford 15 workers and the same number of machines, the same 5 machines with the same budget. So the isocost line here shifts outwards to show that more labor can be hired. However, because the price of labor has fallen relative to capital, the rate at which the factory trades off labor for capital also changes. So that causes the line to rotate. So we have both going on simultaneously. In the last chapter, when we were exploring the labor supply curve, we decomposed the effect of a wage change on the hours worked into income and substitution effects to see how workers respond. In this chapter, we can do the same for firms and their decision to hire. So think of it this way. The wage cut will reduce the price of labor relative to capital, making it so that hiring an additional employee is relatively less costly than before. So now instead of paying $40 an hour, say you're paying $38 an hour. This really adds up over time. So the firm will be willing to hire more workers and rely less on capital. So now their production will be less labor intensive. Excuse me, it will be more labor intensive because they will have more workers relative to their capital. However, there's another effect present at the same time. This reduction in wages, remember, it reduces the marginal cost of production too. So firms can increase production more cheaply. Remember, they produce where the marginal cost equals the marginal benefits. So if the marginal cost goes down, they need less in the way of prices to maximize their profit. They can charge less for those same goods and still increase their production to maximize their profits. So as they increase production, they'll need additional workers. So both of these combine to affect the firm's decision-making process. In this case, both encourage a firm to expand, and we can see that in the graph right here. So in this figure, initially our firm is at point P, which is their profit maximizing point. The line W0 right here is their initial wage rate, or the hourly wage initially. And their isocost curve shows that they'll be producing 100 units of output. So this curve right here, that's tangent to the isocost line, signifies 100 units being produced. At this point, they'll employ 25 workers. So what happens when the firm reduces wages from W0 to W1? The substitution effect can be seen from the move from point P to point R. So going from here to here, now that the firm is paying a lower wage, it means the slope of the wage curve will be shallower. And the firm can move out to a farther isoquant curve, which in this case, this line right here, which represents the output of 150 units. And that says the firm will hire 50 workers. But now, why do we have this odd line DD right here? Note this is parallel to the original wage rate. It represents the same wage rate that we saw initially, just shifted out to the right. This is representing the scale effect for the firm. So it shows the effect of increasing production because it's now relatively cheaper. In practice, a firm would move to the new production and worker level in two moves. First, they move from point P to point Q. So they increase their employment, in this case, from 25 workers to 40 workers, and they increase how much capital they would use. But they move along that isoquant curve, that the 150 units of production, down to this new wage rate line. So what's important to note here is that while the effect on workers is clear, in this case, decrease in wage rate is going to increase the number of workers, the effect on capital is ambiguous, depending on whether the scale effect or the substitution effect is larger. So if the scale effect is larger, which is depicted in this picture here, the expansion will result in more capital and more workers. So looking at point P, again, 25 workers moving out to point R, 50 workers. But also note on the y-axis, which is the amount of capital being used, moving from point P to point R, we end up with more capital being used in production too. Again, because the scale effect dominates, in this case, the scale effect is larger, firms can produce more, they're going to need more capital as well in the long run. However, the opposite can also be true. If the substitution effect is larger, then the capital that the firm uses will fall while the number of workers rise. So instead of moving from point P to point R up here, maybe point R would be somewhere down here in that case. So there ends up being less capital originally. The most important takeaway from this is that both the substitution effect and the scale effects take place when the wage rate changes. Firms are taking both into account, not just one. When wage rates rise, we see the opposite happen. Basically, if the only change is in wage rates, then the firm will reduce production and shift to more capital-intensive production. So they'll hire fewer workers and use more capital in production. Okay, so we're going to ignore some of these special cases and these specific examples. I don't think that's important for this class. I also don't want to focus too much on elasticity here. There are like some problems and stuff in the chapter, but I don't think that's really necessary for our purposes. But I do want you to kind of understand the basics because it is important to understand the elasticity of substitution. So remember, we use elasticity to measure the responsiveness of changes. In this case, we can do it for changes in employment due to changes in wages. So this relates to how firms adjust their labor to capital ratio when the cost of one input changes compared to the cost of another. If the elasticity of substitution is high, firms can easily switch between labor and capital when wages change. If it's low, then it's harder for firms to make these adjustments. This means that industries with high elasticity can more easily replace workers with machines when wages rises. But industries with low elasticity, it's more difficult to replace workers with machines. So the difference in elasticity in the labor demand by firms differs between the short run and the long run. So we have two curves here, one representing the short run and one representing the long run. The simple reason is that in the long run, firms can vary more things. They can add more or less capital, expand to a larger facility, or shrink to a smaller one, et cetera, et cetera. Tons of different things that they can change. That's why, over the long run, firms have more flexibility to adjust both capital and labor. Short-run adjustments are more limited since firms can't quickly change their capital stock, and that's why we see a much steeper short-run labor demand curve. Marshall's rules of derived labor demand help explain the factors that determine how responsive or how elastic the demand for labor is to changes in wages. These rules give us some insight into how firms adjust their labor demand in response to wage changes based on 4 key factors. And I'll briefly touch on each of these here. So Marshall's rules explain when firms are more likely or less likely to reduce labor in response to wage increases. Now, in industries where product demand is elastic, labor can easily be substituted by capital. Labor represents a large share of costs, where capital is easily available. Labor demand will be more sensitive to wage changes. So let's take them each in turn here. First, labor demand is more elastic when the elasticity of substitution of labor and capital is greater. So the easier it is to substitute labor with capital, so things like machines, the more elastic the demand for labor is. If firms can easily replace workers with machines, it will be more responsive to wage changes. So if wages rise, the firm will substitute labor with cheaper capital, like automation or robot. So for example, in a car manufacturing plant, if wages rise, the company may choose to use more robots to assemble cars instead of hiring additional workers. Next, labor demand is more elastic when the elasticity of demand for the firm's output is greater. In other words, the more elastic the demand for the firm's product, the more elastic the demand for labor. If the demand for a firm's product is very sensitive to price changes, then when wages rise and thus production costs rise, the firm cannot easily pass on those costs to consumers. This forces the firm to reduce labor more significantly. So, for an example, a fast food restaurant faces strong competition. So if wages go up, they can't raise burger prices much without losing their customers. So instead, a firm will likely cut back on workers instead. Next, labor demand is more elastic when labor share in total cost of production is greater. The larger the share of total production costs the labor represents, the more elastic the demand for labor. If labor is a big part of a firm's cost, even small changes in wages will have a big effect on the total cost. This ends up making the firm more responsive to changes in wages. So in industries like construction, where labor is a very significant cost, a rise in wages can drastically increase costs, which causes firms to cut back on hiring. And finally, labor demand is more elastic when the elasticity of supply of other factors of production, such as capital, is greater. So the more elastic the supply of other factors, the more elastic the demand for labor. If firms can easily get more capital or other types of inputs, they will adjust their labor demand more in response to wage changes. So if capital is hard to obtain or expensive, firms may be forced to stick with their current mix of labor and capital, even if wages rise. So for instance, in the tech industry, where it's easy to get more machines and equipment, a wage increase might lead firms to use more capital instead of labor. So far, we've assumed that there are only two inputs, labor and capital. And we assume that labor and capital are identical. Each unit is exactly the same. So each worker has the same level of skills and productivity, and all capital can be used interchangeably. Just a second or two of thought should make you think, hey, that's not true. And you're absolutely right. Remember, we often simplify things so that we can actually work with the models. Had we started out with a very complex model with a lot of different types of labor and capital, it would have been really difficult to work through. So we know that there are different types of workers with varying levels of skills and abilities, and capital often has specific uses, and new equipment can be better than old equipment. Or maybe workers don't know how to use the new equipment. Whatever the case is, often there are differences between the two. So when a firm uses multiple inputs, like different types of workers, different machines, potentially different materials, the firm will still face diminishing returns from each input. As more of any one input is used, its contribution output decreases, holding all the other inputs constant. So this is the same principle that we see in the two-factor case with labor and capital. When we just break it up, or maybe break capital and labor each into different categories, we still see the same thing holding because of the diminishing returns. So the firm will try to balance its use of inputs in a way that maximizes outputs to the lowest cost. They're still going to do that no matter how many inputs we're including in our model. So think about the pizza restaurant we talked about earlier. So I just talked about employees and capital to start out, but we can break that down further to be more realistic. The restaurant might use several different inputs. So you have cooks, servers, cleaning staff, you have ovens, tables, cash registers, all these different things. Let's hold all those constant, but just add more cooks. Initially, adding more cooks will increase the number of meals produced, but eventually, after a point, adding more cooks without increasing kitchen space or the number of ovens or numbers of tables in the restaurant just leads to congestion and eventually will lower productivity. The same applies when there are more factors of production. Eventually, the firm will reach a point when adding more of one input without increasing any of the others leads to diminishing returns. So initially, it was just simpler to rely on two inputs to see how the relationship holds more clearly. The key thing to remember here is that no matter how many inputs a firm has, it will still balance those inputs by comparing their costs and contributions to output, just as it does with two factors. Concept of diminishing returns, which holds no matter how many factors or inputs we're including, ensures that firms optimize by using different inputs efficiently. Now, we haven't really talked about substitutes and complements in this class. So I'll do a high-level summary real quick, just to show how firms deal with this. Basically, if firms are substitutes, using more of one will cause you to use less of the other. Conversely, if goods are complements, you need to use them together. So using more of one will cause you to use more of the other. Since it's around lunchtime when I'm recording this lecture, let's think of food. So hot dogs and hamburgers, for an individual person, I'm thinking my own lunch, hot dogs and hamburgers for me are substitutes. If I eat more hot dogs, I'll be able to eat fewer hamburgers. However, for example, for complements, hot dogs and hot dog buns are an example. So if I'm eating a hot dog, odds are I'm going to put it on a bun. So when I consume a hot dog, I'm also consuming a hot dog bun. For firms, if inputs in the production process are substitutes, when the price of one increases, firms will use more of the other. They'll shift to the relatively less expensive one. If the price of one falls, they'll use more of that input and less of now the relatively more expensive one. So for instance, a factory might substitute nails for screws because they use the same purpose in building furniture. So if the price of screws increase, firms will try to use more nails in the production process instead of screws because now it's relatively cheaper. Again, because they're substitutes. You're only using one or the other. Now, if two inputs are complements, then firms will use them together. So if the price of one increases, then they'll use less of both. So if the price of both decreases, then firms will use more of both. It's the exact opposite. So in this case, think of the same factory using nuts and bolts since they're used together. So if the price of bolts increase, the firms will also use fewer nuts because you're not using one without the other. All right. And now on this slide, we'll have some spoilers for chapter 4. We can combine the labor market supply curve and labor market demand curve on the same graph. They will cross at one point, in this case here in the center at the wage rate star and employment level star. The reason they cross at one point is that the supply curve slopes upwards and the demand curve slopes downward. At the single point where they intersect, we call this the labor market equilibrium, where the number of workers willing to work at that wage equals the number of workers that firms are willing to hire at that wage. And we'll be exploring this in greater depth in the next chapter. So that brings us to the end of this module and this chapter 3. We have some assignments this week, and next week will be the midterm exam. I will be providing a sort of review for you guys so you know what concepts are going to be covered. But obviously feel free to reach out and talk to me or ask me questions about what's going to be on the exam. I recognize that for the midterm exam, it can be kind of daunting the first time you have, the exam in a class because you don't know, what the professor is going to include on it, what kind of questions are going to be. I don't want you guys to be worried about that. I just want to make sure that this is able to make sure that you understand the material. So I'm not trying to hide things or do like trick questions or anything like that. So I'll try to be as open as possible for this so you're not worried about that sort of formatting stuff or what types of questions. You can focus on making sure that you know the material.